Mark did not hesitate. He yanked the wedding ring off Nia's fingers so hard, she cried out with pain, the gold band scraping against her knuckle until it drew a thin line of crimson. The sound of her sharp intake of breath echoed through the vaulted ceilings of the church, a space that only moments ago had been filled with the warm scent of lilies and the joyful humming of a gospel choir. Jane stood frozen, her white lace veil trembling like a fallen wing against her shoulders as she looked at her husband-to-be. This was not the man who had promised to cherish her for the rest of his life. This was a stranger with eyes like flint and a mouth twisted into a sneer of utter contempt that made her skin crawl. Mark threw the ring onto the polished marble floor, where it skittered and clattered, the sound ringing out like a death knell in the sudden, suffocating silence of the sanctuary. He didn't look at Jane's face. He looked at the woman standing in the third row, a woman named Sloane who was already smirking behind her silk fan. The betrayal was so sudden and so public that the air seemed to vanish from the room, leaving Jane gasping in the vacuum of her own humiliation. The 300 guests, the very pillars of their community, sat in a silence, so heavy it felt physical, their eyes boring into her back. Jane could feel the heat of their stares, the pitying glances of her bridesmaids, and the muffled sob of Aunt Bessie in the front row. Her hand, now bare and throbbing from the force of his pull, hovered over her heart as if trying to hold the pieces of her life together. Mark stepped back, his voice cutting through the stillness with a cruel, calculated edge that was designed to wound. "I can't do this," he said, loud enough for the back row to hear. "I could never marry a woman as boring and predictable as you, Jane. I only stayed this long to ensure your father's investment in my firm was secure. Now that the papers are signed, I'm done playing the role of the doting fiancé. I'm leaving now to be with a woman who actually challenges me, someone who belongs in my world." Every word was a lash, a deliberate attempt to strip her of her dignity in the one place she was supposed to feel the most protected. The world blurred at the edges, the vibrant stained glass melting into smears of red and blue as Jane struggled to remain upright. She was 25 years old, standing at the altar of her dreams, and she had just been discarded like trash in front of everyone she had ever known. The humiliation was a cold, rising tide, threatening to pull her under until she drowned in the whispers of the congregation, but then a shadow moved from the back of the church. It cut through the light with the precision of a surgical blade, drawing every eye away from the wreckage of the wedding. It was Kongdae who moved first, his presence commanding the space before he even spoke a single word. He had been sitting in the shadows of the rear pews, an uninvited guest whose reputation preceded him, a man the newspapers called a legitimate businessman but the streets called the Korean Mafia boss. He stood with a predatory grace, his dark suit tailored to perfection, his aura one of absolute, terrifying stillness that made the air in the church grow cold. As Mark continued his tirade, oblivious to the shift in the room's gravity, Kongdae began to walk down the center aisle. The rhythmic click of his shoes on the marble was the only sound that mattered, a steady beat that signaled the arrival of something inevitable. Jane watched him, her breath hitching in her throat as the tall, imposing figure drew closer. She had met him once, months ago, when she had accidentally helped his younger sister at a high-profile charity gala, and he had looked at her then with an intensity that haunted her dreams for weeks. Now, he was here, a dark specter in a house of God, his eyes fixed not on the shocked crowd or the preening groom, but solely on her. Mark finally noticed the intrusion, his face turning from a mask of arrogance to one of confused irritation. "Who the hell are you?" he spat, his voice cracking slightly as he realized the man approaching was not a member of the church. The words died in his throat as Kongdae reached the altar, the power dynamic in the room shifting so violently it was almost visible. Kongdae didn't even acknowledge Mark's existence. He stood directly in front of Jane, his large frame shielding her from the prying eyes of the congregation. He reached out, his hand gloved in black leather, and gently lifted her chin so she was forced to look into his dark, fathomless eyes. In that moment, the noise of the church faded into nothingness. There was only the scent of his expensive cologne, sandalwood and cold rain, and the steady, grounding heat of his presence. Jane felt a spark of something she couldn't name, a strange, desperate courage that flared up from the ashes of her shame. She looked past him at Mark, whose face was beginning to pale as he recognized the man standing before him. "I will marry the Korean Mafia boss instead," Jane said, her voice starting as a whisper but gaining a terrifying clarity that reached every corner of the sanctuary. The words felt like a match dropped into a pool of gasoline. Mark's face went white, his jaw dropping as he took a stumbling step back, nearly tripping over the hem of Jane's dress. The guests gasped in a collective wave of shock that rippled through the pews like a physical blow, but Jane didn't waver for a second. She reached out and placed her small, trembling hand on Kongdae's chest, feeling the heavy, rhythmic thrum of a heart that beat with the steady pace of a soldier. She was done being the victim of a man who didn't deserve her loyalty or her love. If her life was to be destroyed today, she would be the one to choose the architect of its reconstruction. Kongdae's eyes narrowed slightly, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, a look of dark approval that sent a shiver of both fear and excitement down her spine. He didn't ask for clarification or a reason. He simply turned his head toward the priest, who was clutching his Bible as if it were a shield against a coming storm. "Proceed," Kongdae commanded, his voice a low, melodic rumble that brooked no argument and permitted no hesitation. The authority in his tone was absolute, a force of nature that silenced the whispers and froze Mark in his tracks. The groom, the man who had just tried to ruin Jane's life for a real estate deal, looked like a ghost of himself, his skin sallow and his eyes darting frantically toward the exit. But Kongdae's men were already there, two silent giants in dark coats standing by the heavy oak doors, ensuring that no one left until the debt of honor had been settled in full. Jane felt the weight of her decisions settling into her bones, turning her blood to ice and iron. She was trading a suburban lie for a dangerous truth, a public humiliation for a private sanctuary. As the priest began to stammer through the vows, skipping over the parts that no longer applied, Jane didn't look back at the pews or the man who had betrayed her. She kept her eyes locked on Kongdae, the man who had just stepped into the line of fire to claim a woman he barely knew. When he produced a ring from his own pocket, a heavy platinum band set with a diamond the color of a winter sky, and slid it onto her finger, the cold metal felt like a promise. "With this," he whispered, his voice for her ears only, "you are mine, and I do not lose what belongs to me." The ceremony ended not with a celebration, but with a strategic withdrawal. As they were pronounced husband and wife, the atmosphere in the church was thick with a tension so sharp it could have drawn blood. Kongdae didn't wait for the customary kiss or the walk down the aisle. He simply swept Jane toward the side exit, his arm around her waist a solid, unyielding barrier between her and the world that had just tried to break her. Outside, the air was crisp and biting, the afternoon sun glinting off the fleet of black SUVs that lined the curb like a funeral procession for her old life. The transition from the sacred space of the church to the clinical, high-tech world of Kongdae was instantaneous and jarring. His men moved with a silent, lethal efficiency, opening doors and scanning the perimeter as Jane was ushered into the back of a reinforced limousine. The leather was cool against her skin, the interior smelling of cedar and old money. As the door clicked shut, the silence was absolute, a heavy velvet curtain that blocked out the shouts of the paparazzi who had arrived and the distant sirens of a city that had no idea what had just transpired at the altar. Jane sat in the corner of the seat, her white dress billowing around her like a storm cloud, her hands shaking as the adrenaline finally began to ebb. Kongdae sat beside her, giving her space but never truly taking his eyes off her. He watched the way her breath hitched and the way she worried her lower lip. He reached into a small compartment and pulled out a clean, linen handkerchief, handing it to her without a word. Jane took it, dabbing at the tears she hadn't realized were falling. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the day. Kongdae looked out the tinted window as the city blurred past them into a streak of gray and neon. "I don't let beautiful things be trampled by cowards," he replied, his voice devoid of sentiment, but filled with a quiet, terrifying conviction. Mark thought he could use you as a stepping stone. He didn't realize he was standing on a mountain. Now, he will learn what happens to those who try to climb where they don't belong. The drive to his estate felt like a journey between worlds, leaving the familiar streets of her neighborhood for the guarded mansions of the coast. When the car finally came to a stop, Jane saw the house, a sprawling masterpiece of glass and steel that overlooked the crashing gray waves of the ocean. It was a palace of solitude, a place where secrets were kept and power was wielded with a silent hand. Kongdae led her inside, the foyer rising up in a cathedral of polished stone and modern art. The house was silent, staffed by people who moved like ghosts, their eyes averted as the master of the house returned with his new bride. He stopped at the base of the grand staircase and turned to her. "You will be safe here, Jane," he said, using her name for the first time with a gravity that made her heart stutter. "But safety comes with a price. My world is not kind to outsiders, and you have just become the center of it." He gestured to a young woman standing nearby. "This is Hannah. She will show you to your quarters and provide you with whatever you need. I have matters to attend to regarding your former fiancé. He is a debt that a ring cannot pay." Jane watched him walk away, his silhouette receding into the depths of the house. Hannah led her up the stairs to a suite of rooms that were larger than Jane's entire apartment. The bedroom was a study in monochromatic luxury, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the darkening sea. A fire was already crackling in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the silk-covered walls. Jane stood in the center of the room, the weight of her wedding dress suddenly unbearable. With trembling hands, she began to reach for the buttons at her back, but the intricate lace was too complex. She let out a frustrated sob, the reality of the day finally crashing down on her. The door opened softly, and it was Kongdae who stepped back into the room. He had removed his jacket and tie, the top buttons of his shirt undone. "Turn around," he commanded softly. Jane froze, her heart hammering, but she obeyed. She felt his large, warm hands on her shoulders. He began to work the buttons, his movements slow and methodical. As the dress began to loosen, Jane felt a sense of release, as if he were peeling away the layers of her humiliation one by one. When the last button was undone, the dress slumped forward, and she caught it against her chest. Kongdae didn't move away. He stayed close, his presence a warm shield at her back. "You are no longer that man's victim," he whispered. "You are my wife. And in this house, my word is law. No one will ever look at you with anything but respect again." The peace of the evening was shattered an hour later by a sharp knock at the door. One of Kongdae's security team entered, his face grim and tight with urgency. "Boss, we have a problem. Mark's family is at the gate, and they brought the police. They're making a scene, claiming you kidnapped her from the church." Kongdae's hand tightened slightly on Jane's shoulder before he let go, his entire demeanor shifting back into the cold, authoritative boss. He turned toward the door, his eyes flashing with a dangerous light. Jane felt a surge of fear, but it wasn't for herself. She watched as Kongdae checked a security feed on a sleek device. "They want a show," he muttered. "I'll handle this. Stay here, Jane." But Jane stood up, wrapping a heavy silk robe around her shoulders. "Wait," she said, her voice urgent and clear. "If you go out there and use force, it only proves them right. They'll use it to drag my name through the mud again. Let me go with you. Let them see that I chose this." Kongdae looked at her for a long beat, searching her face for any sign of hesitation. "It won't be pleasant out there," he warned. Jane stepped toward him, her eyes steady. "I've already had the most unpleasant day of my life. I'm not hiding in a bedroom while you fight a battle that started with my honor." A flicker of genuine admiration crossed Kongdae's face. He nodded slowly. "Very well, Jane. Let's go show them exactly what you've chosen." They walked down the grand staircase and out to the massive iron gates where the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers cut through the evening mist. Mark stood there, looking frantic, flanked by his sobbing mother. "There she is, Mark shouted, pointing at Jane. Officer, look at her. She's been coerced. He took her right from the altar. Jane stepped forward into the cold glare of the sirens. I am neither kidnapped nor coerced, Mark, she said, her voice echoing in the quiet night. I chose to leave with my husband because he is 10 times the man you will ever be. You made it very clear in front of 300 people that I was nothing to you. Kongdae saw my worth when you were too blind to see anything but a bank account. Now, get off this property before I file charges for the assault you committed on my hand when you ripped that ring off the officers. Seeing the lack of duress on Jane's face and the way she stood tall beside Kongdae, began to usher the shouting family away. Is this true, ma'am? The lead officer asked. Every word, Jane replied. I am exactly where I want to be. As the police cars retreated and the silence of the coast returned, Kongdae led Jane back into the house and into a smaller, more intimate study. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid and handed one to her. You handled that well, he said, his voice a low vibration. Most people would have stayed inside. Jane took a sip, the liquid burning a trail of warmth through her. I'm tired of being the person everyone expects me to be, she admitted, sitting in a velvet chair. Why did you really do it, Kongdae? You don't strike me as a man who acts on impulse. Kongdae sat opposite her, his eyes fixed on hers. I saw you at the gala months ago, he began. You were the only person in that room who wasn't wearing a mask. When my sister was embarrassed, you were the only one who helped her without looking for a camera to record your kindness. I knew then that Mark didn't deserve you. I've had my eyes on his firm for a long time, and I knew what he planned to do today. I didn't come to the church to cause a scene, Jane. I came to provide an exit. I didn't expect you to take it with such fire. He reached across and took her hand, his thumb tracing the line of her new ring. I'm not a good man by the standards of the world, you know. My hands are not clean, but I will never lie to you, and I will never let anyone hurt you again. In my world, loyalty is the only currency that matters, and you have already shown me yours. Jane looked at their joined hands, the contrast of her skin against his, and felt a strange, terrifying sense of belonging. I don't know anything about your world, she whispered. You don't need to, he replied. You only need to know me. The honesty in his voice was a shield, protecting her from the doubts that had plagued her all day. She realized that while she had lost the life she thought she wanted, she had gained something far more substantial, a man who saw her as a partner rather than a prize. I want to know, she said, her voice gaining strength. I want to know everything. If I'm going to be your wife, I'm not going to be a secret you keep in a glass house. Kongdae smiled then, a real, rare smile that transformed his face. Then tomorrow, we begin your education. The following morning brought the first real test of her new life. As Jane sat at the breakfast table, a man with a scarred brow and a cold expression entered the room. This was Dae-ho, Kongdae's second in command, and he did not look pleased. He ignored Jane, speaking directly to Kongdae in a low, urgent tone. The council is meeting tonight. They are calling this marriage a reckless distraction. They think you've made us vulnerable by bringing an outsider into the inner circle. There are whispers of a challenge. Boss Kongdae didn't look up from his coffee. Let them whisper, he said. The council exists because I allow it to exist. If they think my marriage makes me weak, they have forgotten how I attain this seat. Dae-ho flicked a glance at Jane, one filled with naked suspicion. They think you've grown soft because of a pretty face. They're saying you've traded your edge for a wedding gown. Jane set her fork down, the sound sharp against the china. If the council thinks I'm a weakness, they're as foolish as my ex-fiancé, she said, her voice cool and steady. I may be an outsider, but I'm not a fool. And I certainly didn't marry your boss to be his distraction. I married him because he was the only man in that church with the courage to act. Dae-ho stared at her, surprised by her defiance. Kongdae let out a short, dark laugh. You heard her, Dae-ho. Tell the council that if they want to test my wife's strength, they are welcome to try. But remind them that anyone who touches her will have to answer to me personally, and I am not in a forgiving mood lately. As Dae-ho bowed and left the room, the tension remained, a heavy weight in the air. Jane looked at Kongdae, her heart racing. Is it going to be like this every day? She asked. He reached out and squeezed her hand. Not every day, he promised. Some days will be worse. But you won't be alone for any of them. She realized then that her marriage wasn't just a romantic escape. It was a political maneuver in a world she barely understood. But as she looked into Kongdae's eyes, she felt a surge of resolve. She had been humiliated in the world of the good people. She would not be intimidated in the world of the bad ones. The threat became physical much sooner than anticipated. That night, as the fog rolled in from the sea, the estate's silent alarms began to pulse a rhythmic warning. Jane was startled awake by the sound of muffled shouting and the distant crack of gunfire. Before she could even process the noise, Kongdae was in the room, moving with the lethal grace of a predator. He was already armed, his face set in a mask of grim determination. Stay in the center of the room, away from the windows, he commanded. The perimeter was breached. It's a targeted hit, likely sanctioned by someone on the council. He moved toward the door, but a heavy thud against the balcony glass stopped him. Two men in tactical gear smashed through the windows, glass raining down on the silk carpets. Everything happened in a blur of motion. Kongdae fired with clinical precision, but as he moved to neutralize the first intruder, the second aimed a weapon directly at his back. Jane didn't think, she acted. She grabbed a heavy bronze lamp from the nightstand and hurled it with all her strength at the second man. The impact didn't knock him out, but it spoiled his aim. His shot went wide, shattering a mirror, giving Kongdae the split second he needed to turn and end the threat. The room fell into a ringing, terrifying silence. Kongdae stood over the fallen men, his chest heaving. He turned to Jane, his eyes wide with a mixture of fury and absolute terror. I told you to stay back, he roared, but he crossed the room and pulled her into a crushing embrace, his hands trembling as they moved over her hair. You could have been killed, Jane. Do you understand? You could have died. Jane held onto him, her face buried in his chest. I wasn't going to let them take you, she whispered. I've already lost one life. I'm not losing this 1 inch, he pulled back, cupping her face in his hands. I have never been afraid of anything in my life, he said, his voice raw. But seeing that man point a gun at you, I have never known fear like that. You are my heart, Jane. You cannot put yourself in danger like that again. The aftermath of the attack was a turning point for both of them. In the days that followed, Kongdae systematically removed every person who had been involved in the betrayal, showing a side of himself that was cold, calculated, and utterly uncompromising. But with Jane, he was different. Tender, protective, and increasingly open about the burdens he carried. They spent hours talking on the terrace, the sound of the ocean providing a backdrop to the building of their new life. I used to think my world was the only one that mattered, Jane said one evening, watching the moon rise over the water. But standing at that altar, I realized that the people I thought were my friends were just spectators at my execution. You are the only one who saw me as a person. Kongdae stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. In my world, we don't have the luxury of spectators, he said softly. We only have allies and enemies. And you, Jane, are the most powerful ally I've ever had. You didn't just save my life the other night. You gave me a reason to want to keep it. Jane turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had changed everything for her. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding trust that had been forged in fire and blood. What happens now? She asked. Now. Kongdae replied, leaning down to press his forehead against hers. We show the world that they were wrong about both of us. We build something that can't be broken by whispers or bullets. We build a future, Jane. Together. He kissed her then, a slow, lingering promise of a lifetime spent in each other's shadows and light. The girl who had been discarded at the altar was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her worth and a man who would kill to defend it. As they stood together on the edge of the cliffs, the heavy platinum ring on Jane's finger caught the moonlight, a permanent symbol of a chosen destiny. The world might still be dangerous and the council might still be watching, but for the first time in her life, Jane felt truly and completely safe. "I'm ready," she whispered against his lips. "I know you are," he replied. "And so am I." Together, they turned back toward the house, walking hand in hand into the heart of their empire.